for that insightful panel discussion, Priya and all the panelists. My name is Pranjali Kirloskar. I'm lecturer at Manipal Center for European Studies, Mahe, Manipal. Moving on, we begin with the last session of the day, which is titled Diagnosing and Decrypting Asymmetries in Cross-Border Education, chaired by Dr. Emnet Woldegiorgis. To introduce Dr. Emnet, he is an associate professor of higher education studies at the Ali Mazouria Center for Higher Education Studies, University of Johannesburg. He did his PhD at the University of Bayreuth, Germany, where he also worked as a postdoctoral researcher. He has published several academic works on theories of regionalization, internationalization, academic mobility, economics of higher education, partnership models, and decolonization issues. Before I hand over this session to Dr. Emnet, I would like to mention that each speaker is given about 15 minutes to present his or her views. At the count of 12, I may ring a bell if that's okay with Dr. Emnet. And I request everyone, all speakers, to please keep time while they present. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Emnet.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I would also like to thank the organizers of the conference for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to engage in such exciting topics. Good afternoon, participants, presenters, and thank you for joining us in this exciting journey. As you can see on the program, this session focuses on cross-border education and knowledge mobility, which has been one of the most dynamic topics since a long time, including the spatial mobility of people and practice, technologies and objects. Knowledge and ideas have shaped the production, circulation, and transfer of knowledge in different historical and geographic contexts. The research community has also been trying to come up with various yet innovative conceptual approach to understand this global phenomena. The bottom line is that the politics of knowledge production and sharing has always been a subject of heated debate. Today, we have 4 presentations focusing on the theme of cross-border education and knowledge mobility. And as indicated previously, each presenter has 50 minutes to present their papers. And after that, we will have time for discussion. The first presenter is Mr. Kennedy Monari. Sorry if I mispronounce your names. Mr. Monari is an education in emergency specialist, trainer, teacher, and a researcher with a specialist focusing on designing and implementing educational projects from the emergency phase to post-conflict situation, emphasizing the mechanisms required to ensure the protection of children affected by conflict, disaster, and improve quality of education during and after humanitarian crisis, technical and strategic support to the emergency team on education response and recovery. Today, Mr. Monari will present his idea on the title, Diagnosis of Imbalance in Knowledge Mobility across different borders. We are very happy to have you. Please proceed. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Emnet. Let me first share my screen. I'm very much glad today to present a diagnostic imbalance that exists in the flow of knowledge and cross-border mobility of scholars. This work is primarily conceptual, drawing on a secondary source of literature, as well as interviews and reports from major bodies, ministries, and institutions around the world. So the flow of Indian students who choose Europe as a destination for higher education is examined in this article using student migration data, qualitative material from recorded interviews, and evidence from recent report. And this work aims to add to the greater body of knowledge across on cross-border knowledge flow by providing insight into the factors that drive imbalances and inequalities in the knowledge mobility between India and Europe. First, I just want to recognize that India is an excellent location for obtaining a high-end education. India University provide wide range of higher education opportunity that benefit both India and the rest of the world. Europe as well has always been an important center of learning and continues to attract students from across the world. I'll begin presentation by defining what is cross-border education. And I think this concept has been highlighted by the previous speakers. Cross-border education, in simpler terms, it is a process of opening up education system so that its inputs and outputs are not limited by national borders. Cross-border education is seen as a way countries adapt to globalization effects. So higher education should respond to global enlightenment as a big step towards conforming international standards. And when we talk about the higher education, the future of higher education cannot be addressed without first assessing national, regional, and global contexts in which they're expected to perform its mission. The next slides, it presents various forms of cross-border education, and mobility across different borders can take various forms, such as attracting international students or sending students abroad for undergraduate and postgraduate programs, attracting academics, research and development employees, staff exchange program and visit. And as we talk today, government in many countries are more concerned about student and worker mobility. Many developing countries, for example, have programs to help students and government employees to acquire university courses abroad or specialized training. And there are numerous multilateral programs for developing countries, such as Erasmus and Node+. Subsequently, student migration has featured in the agenda of several countries trying to strengthen international relations and has become an important platform for multilateral cooperation. The strategic relationship between India, an emerging economic power, and the European Union are an ideal example of such economic cooperation. So the EU-India Common Agenda on Migration and Mobility, endorsed in 2016, is a significant step forward in furthering cooperation on migration and management between both sides. The next slides presents a stock of Indian students studying overseas. And from the data table that you see, it shows a total of 71,769 Indians went abroad to study until February 2021. And the figure were rising at a 15% year-over rate, with the exception of 2020 and 2021 as a result of COVID-19 implication and travel restriction. Despite this, India now ranks second, now ranks second only to China in terms of the number of students who travel overseas to pursue international degrees. According to Eurostat 2019, United Kingdom, Germany, France received the most Indian students in Europe, and the UK dominates the market for both international and Indian students in Europe. So we talk about international student mobility, which has more than doubled in the last decade, reflects a global imbalance. And these movements have always been clearly in favor of European nations. So, and the globalization has remarkably increased awareness on availability of educational opportunities and motivation to acquire higher education beyond national borders, and has a strong impact on Indian students wanting to study abroad. My next slide, it presents the migration patterns of India students to Europe. And then as we talk about the growth of internationalization, coupled with the demographic slowdown in Europe and demand for skilled human capital, has resulted in the rise in international migration as a new form of migration in recent years. So in 2020, more than 1/5, that is 20.6% of European Union population was aged 65 and over. And the share of the people aged 80 years or above in the European Union population is projected to have a 2.5-fold increase between 2020 and 2021. That is a rise from 5.9 to 14.6%. So there's a policy plan on illegal migration, a report adopted in this year, 2021, September, envisage a scheme whereby skilled immigrants are allowed to work and live in the EU. So international migration acts as an automatic demographic stabilizer. People need to move from countries with a fast growing population to aging countries with a slow growing population. So the bottom line is that only net migration can ensure population stability or growth in aging advanced economies of the European Union. The next slide, it presents a stock of flow of Indian students, of Indians to major EU countries. And from the migration data, you see India is a source of major, is a source of migrants, especially of high skilled and well-trained workers. Migrants account for around 47% of the increase in the workforce in the United States and 70% in Europe over the past 10 years. So the growth in the knowledge-intensive activity in the developed world has led to the growing demand for science and engineering professionals. So with an important reserve of trained people in this domain, India is becoming a major supplier of a human capital for advanced economies. India is sending a large of these specialists compared to other important origin countries. We talk about the next slide presents migrations of Indians to EU for employment purpose. And from the data presents a comprehensive picture of the trends and patterns of international migration among Indians. As India has consistently ranked second highest in terms of resident permit received for employment purpose. Also, the government of both sides have started facilitating various mobility between the two regions by signing bilateral and multilateral agreements in various areas such as skills development, vocational training, social security, trade and investment. And also the next slides presents migration of Indians to EU for education purpose. And Europe has always been an important center of learning and continues to attract students from across the world. So globalization, increasing awareness on the availability of education opportunities and the motivation to acquire higher education beyond national borders has had a strong impact on Indian students wanting to study abroad. So data on resident permits issued to Indians by EU state for education purpose show consistent increase between 2008 and 2018, with the exception of 2020 and 2021 as a result of COVID-19 issues. Now, the next slide presents data on EU-India migration and mobility flows. So it is very critical and challenging for developing countries to attract expertise and knowledge from more developed countries. It is critical because knowledge flow from the technology frontiers, who are a major source of learning. It is difficult because underdeveloped countries lack the necessary expertise and infrastructure to truly benefit from them. So conducting a research and development initiative or with the developing countries is both tough and vital from the perspective of a developed country. According to UNESCO 2016, a global knowledge inequalities are mostly manifested in research and innovations, with the growing numbers of nations moving towards knowledge economies and regional collaboration. However, in many nations, public funding for education is under pressure, and does explain a balance that exists between India and Europe. The next slide, we talk about the implication of COVID-19 on international education and knowledge mobility. And these problems have resulted in large declines in the number of students guided by the international platform, or provide guidance on a cross-border education between 2020 and now. While the graph has resumed in 2021, the pandemic wreaked havoc on schools and universities. Shut down, the student community has been severely impacted. According to India data from the Ministry So I'll move straight to the factors that influencing international mobility from India to Europe. And one of the factors that influence Indian students to move to Europe or choose Europe as a destination for higher education has been highlighted. One of the factors is the research, innovations, and students' interest. So European countries are at the forefront of innovation almost in all areas. So recent development in frontier technologies, including artificial intelligence, robotics, and biotechnology, have shown tremendous potential for sustainable development. Yet, there are also risks increasing inequalities by exacerbating and creating a new digital divide between technology, between the haves and the have-nots. Another reason is policies. The policies in Europe are increasingly favoring student mobility, and as you can see, European Union policies, most industrialized country demographic trends are deteriorating, and as a result of this, they face a critical need to recruit migrants who will become an important part of their labor force in the coming years. So in comparison to overseas qualified migrants from developing nations, migrants who receive their degrees as international students outside their native country have a stronger absorbability in the foreign labor markets. And another point is an initiative by the European countries to attract foreign students through scholarship. And financial difficulties are a major determinant of maybe Indian students and all of the students from the developing countries' choice of destination. So European Union has made various scholarships available over time. Students can apply for a number of scholarships, including those granted by institutions. So the Indian government and private business. So the Erasmus Mundus program is one of the most sought after subsidized program for students traveling to Europe. So the European Commission established the initiative in 2001 in order to improve EU third country cooperation in higher education. The next slide talk about a belief that a foreign degree is more desirable and so enhance the likelihood of better employment. So India is a populous country and the job market is very competitive. So the widespread belief that a foreign degree is more desirable and enhance the likelihood of better employment opportunities. So getting back to India, they'll have a better career path. Talk about the challenges in expanding the capacity of higher education in order to meet the demand for higher education in India. And as I say that India is a populous country where people value higher education, people can compromise.
Sorry for interruption. You have 2 minutes left.
Okay, it's okay, it's okay. As I was saying that India is a populous country where people value higher education. People can compromise their necessity to take the children to higher education. So the biggest challenge is expanding the capacity of higher education in order to meet the demand for higher education of the growing population. So of course, quality has always been compromised at the expense of quantity. And also the next slides talk about the rising income level of the middle income bracket. The middle income bracket is a fundamental reason why Indian students have decided that there are no barriers to obtaining education. So this has been made possible by obtaining a degree from foreign university and finding work in the country to pay off the student loans. Also, we have as next point is existing education infrastructures. Infrastructure in India is inadequate and continues to be neglected, and more of the discussion I've had from other scholars. The low level of government spending on education have usually resulted in a severe scarcity of recognized schools. So the situation is made worse by limited number of higher education opportunities available. And next slide talks about the availability of courses in Europe that is not available in India. And you see, Indian students acquired an interest of studying abroad in order to keep up with the worldwide education standard and perfect their talents in order to be globally employable. So courses generating great attention in India include marine, engineering, geophysics, and even game creation and development. So traditional roles are being pushed out by specialized courses like automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science, and business are looking for workers with these skills sets. I think in conclusion, I also suggest area for further research where I also I'm looking forward to collaborative research projects on refugee education, more specifically the borderless higher education for refugees, so that higher education should be increasingly recognized as a crucial for the livelihood of refugees and displaced population caught in emergencies and protracted crises. And also another area is a connected learning, the higher education for refugees, which aims to promote and coordinates support and provision of quality higher education in the context of conflict, crisis, and displacement through blended learning approaches that combine face-to-face and online learning. So I just want to say thank you, and I'd wish to stop at that point.
Thank you, Kennedy, for your insightful presentation. Definitely, we will have a lot of questions on some of the points that you raised. Quite a rich presentation. We will come back to the discussion later. Okay. The next presentation is by Dr. Kurt Hübner and Dr. King. Dr. Hübner is Jane Monnet Chair for European Integration and Global Political Economy, Institute for European Studies at the University of British Columbia, Canada. His research focuses on the interplay of institutions and capital accumulation on the national as well as on the international level. Over the years, his work concentrated on money and currency regimes, politics and economics of European integration, as well as on contradictions and complementaries of sustainability and international competitiveness. Dr. King is also the co-presenter of this paper, is an instructor of political science at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, Canada, with a particular interest in recent reform attempts of secondary education in Germany and France. He also has an interest in the Bologna process, the creation of the European higher education area, and its implication for universities and research agenda in Europe, as well as lessons drawn between Canada and the European Union regarding governance of education in the skill region. They will share with us their ideas on the topic, global knowledge flows, international hierarchies, and the role of nation state. You both are welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for the nice introduction, and good evening. It's I think so roughly after 7 o'clock in the morning, so please be aware we may not be as dynamic as usually, even though I had my third espresso, so that's good. Our piece is actually a kind of side result of a 3-year project funded by the European Union that was dealing with the Bologna process in core EU countries, but also in countries that are not member states of the European Union, but have some kind of close ties. And in this project, we dealt with different kind of areas and topics, but one interest we had was also the changes of, let me just go here to the slideshow, we could see in what we call the global knowledge regime. And this is the topic of our piece. And the research question is pretty straightforward. If you think about it, we all are aware, I think that we share this, knowledge production and dissemination of knowledge is by nature, more or less, a very global process. From the very beginning, if you think about the foundation, the rise of universities, all this was never only restricted to the nation state, it had always a kind of international dimension. But we are not interested in this historical analysis, more what kind of changes, if at all, can be observed in the current global knowledge regime. And what we all can see, and again, I think so that is being shared by all of us, is there are very few very globalized universities at the very top on this hierarchy of universities, and those universities, either by intention or it happens, establish particular kind of rules and norms, and others, the more peripheral universities, are in this open border societies are required to catch up, so to say. And this is the background. So how is this happening? How can we explain why this is happening? And what we are observing, what we are arguing in this little piece is that higher education systems across the world are undergoing processes of convergence. It's not a kind of one-to-one convergence. There are partial convergence processes, but the convergence processes are going towards, let's say, a kind of a joint core values and principles. And we make the argument that this catch-up process is on the one side creating more homogeneity, and the other side also more differentiation. So it's happening at the same time, homogenization as well as differentiation. And we identify in our piece 3 drivers of those particular kind of convergence processes. Number one, this has just been alluded to a bit, the commodification of knowledge workers and students. Number two, across the Western world, but also in the emerging market economies, we see there is a much stronger emphasis on the side of the politics of nation states on human capital formation in a world where skills are very mobile, they can be transported around the world, where knowledge has become a key element of economic success. The processes and the structures and the regimes and the national level of human capital formation has become very critical, and this also drives those kind of convergence processes. And number three, it has to do with the first two ones, but also is a very independent kind of process. We see a kind of quasi-marketization of higher education governance. So there is market forces are very important in this process. And the background is very familiar for all of us. Universities from the very beginning were drivers of knowledge internationalization since they were founded. Now, in the last, let us say, 20 years or so, with this processes of globalization in general, economic globalization, we see that private actors are actually became much more prominent when it comes to the generation as well as the dissemination of knowledge. So universities were falling back. They didn't play for a long time this kind of key role they played in the very, very past. So the private market actors actually think about the big ones, whether it's Google, FaceTime, all those kind of companies have become very, very prominent. And this kind of opening of a gap has been identified. And it's not a reason why the Bologna process, for example, has been established, but definitely a kind of catch up to find ways and norms to position universities in a better way in this globalization of knowledge processes have been very, very critical. So universities have become moved in a kind of catch-up mode, if you would like, and became, in the meantime, very important co-drivers of the internationalization or globalization of knowledge. So universities found their position in this global knowledge regime, but in a way that this kind of co-driver position also came with changes and of a new hierarchy, put it this way, of universities. There are a few leaders, and others, in very direct way, sometimes the indirect way, try to follow, catching up by following the same kind of norms and practices and rules. And what is happening then is this kind of homogenization and at the same time differentiation. And Conrad will now continue and give you the more precise arguments we laid out in our piece.
Thank you, Kurt, and good morning to you. Good evening to our other people at the conference here. So one of the things that, Kurt, you left off here on the knowledge as a commodity or public good. So that's something that perhaps we could briefly address in the Q&A. Could you just move to the next slide so we can take a look at the national knowledge spaces that we're looking at in the convergence dynamics here. And we're distinguishing between three, ideal types of higher education system: a Napoleonic system, a Humboldtian system, and the Anglo-Saxon system. You can see them there on the graph on the slide. Now, one way to think about these national systems, to compare them, is to think in terms of systemic governance and whether, which kind of forces university leadership is most responsive to. Is it the market, the state, or cultural elites such as faculty? Institutions that are responsive, typically are responsive to all these elements to different degrees. Yet historically, the Napoleonic system is very state-centric. It's state-led, centralized. It's a higher education system that's stratified into two major types of public institutions: degree-granting public universities, which most people are quite familiar with, and then a small number of specialized institutions that are a training ground for administrative and technical elites, particularly that function as state functionaries. Here we're thinking of the Grande École in France. The Humboldtian system, we'll skip to the third for a moment, just talk about the Anglo-Saxon system as being quite market sensitive. So if the Humboldtian system or the Napoleonic system is state-centric, the Anglo-Saxon system is a bit more market sensitive. And then finally, the Humboldt system was constructed deliberately in the 19th century to resist both state and market pressures, to allow a good deal of autonomy to researchers and scientists. So the Humboldt system combines teaching and research, and it's trying to keep universities relatively free from direct state influence. Now, there is some post-secondary stratification in the Humboldtian system. There are applied polytechnic universities as well as conventional universities. Yet the system as a whole has very little diversity and stratification. And the model here would be the German system of higher education. And then finally, this Anglo-Saxon system characterized by much diversity, much stratification. So there's a great deal of institutional and programmatic choice, and there's a great variance in tuition costs and perceived quality of these institutions. And this, you can think of the range of institutional types going from vocational colleges, undergraduate teaching-focused universities, much like my own, and elite research universities. So further diversity in terms of so what we're seeing is further diversity in terms of this kind of public and private provision of post-secondary, and there's a great deal of diversity in the Anglo-Saxon system, even when they're predominantly funded by taxpayers. They're public systems, but they do contain numerous private institutions within them, and some of these are private non-profit organizations able to attract huge donations, and think Harvard as the model for this. These elite research universities are now setting the standard, not only within the Anglo-Saxon systems, but in all systems of higher education. You could just move to the next slide, Kurt. Now we're dealing with global knowledge spaces. So Kurt, move to the. So one thing that we could actually, if you could just move back a slide there to global knowledge spaces. Thank you. So an argument could be made that all national higher education systems are undergoing some kind of global convergence towards these Anglo-Saxon norms of higher education. We're most interested in particular higher education regimes in Europe, and this is the Napoleonic, Humboldtian, and how these are converging towards an Anglo-Saxon system. Now, one might anticipate that the opening up of national systems of higher education to kind of globalized sectors or a globalized market is going to expose national universities to global hierarchies. And these hierarchies are typically, characterized by competition. We can see that in global rankings. They're also characterized by power, where some institutions are able to set the standards, and this is often by virtue of their rankings or by perceived, other metrics of perceived quality. The process has simultaneously led to homogenization and differentiation, as Kurt has mentioned, and this is on a global scale. So if we can think about it in terms of higher education systems becoming more Anglo-Saxon-like, individual institutions within those systems are increasingly stratified, distinguished by a place in a global hierarchy. If you could go to the next slide, please. So some evidence of this, some examples and evidence of this convergence. The German Excellence Initiative, over a 15-year period, the German national government was providing 4.5 billion euros to German universities. We're able to demonstrate metrics of excellence, research excellence, stratification, internationalization, and so on. In France, you could see that the state was initially gave public universities complete financial and administrative autonomy, and then followed that by restructuring the entire higher education system into these kind of higher education and research clusters. At the European level, we have the intergovernmental Bologna process, and this has harmonized higher education systems across Europe and beyond Europe as well. And it models their harmonized degrees on Anglo-Saxon structures and cycles of education. So the bachelor's, master's, PhD structure, 3 cycles, and so on, and the idea of semesters and modules and things like this. Now more generally, we can also see a shift in the logic of higher education governance. When we talk about a higher education system, we're typically referring to one where provision and regulation of that system is conducted by the state or by public actors. Now, when we talk about a sector, we're referring to an aspect of the economy where actors are private or some mix of public and private actors. And governance shifts towards increasing coordination and steering of these actors, and in this case, educational institutions, rather than hierarchical governmental regulation, the kind of command and control model. So what we're observing is that national systems of education are kind of being opened up to sectoral governance dynamics. You could go to the next slide there. Thanks, Kurt. So the question is, why is this convergence happening? And part of the answer you can see on the slide here. There are short-term payoffs. All public higher education systems require cost recovery mechanisms. That can mean taxpayer funding, it can mean tuition fees, in some cases alumni donations. And Anglo-Saxon universities were quick to discover that international students presented a really fantastic cost recovery mechanism, a windfall, if you will. Undoubtedly, part of that narrative has centered around international students bringing other kinds of benefits and advantages, aside of financial ones. But it's hard not to see this financial advantage. And you can see a takeoff in international student mobility during the 1990s. And it's not just driven by student demand. It's also driven by certain aspects of educational supply. The demographics in Anglo-Saxon countries, as the previous presenter mentioned, these demographics are shifting and universities would be required to contract. And there's also governmental policy choices in these countries, which would encourage recruitment of international students to make up for domestic austerity measures. But now what we can see, certainly, and this slide demonstrates this, is that international student mobility is a huge global industry currently. And we have Anglo-Saxon universities have a kind of first mover advantage when it comes to this. I mean, there's other advantages, linguistic ones, etc., but this first mover advantage is critical for Anglo-Saxon universities, and other higher education systems and institutions see that success and they want to capitalize on it as well. Kurt, if you could just go to the next slide. Okay, so the drivers of convergence that we have observed are three. One is that international student mobility and the commodification of international students has become a significant element of neoliberalization in higher education and on a global scale. And it's not just the Anglo-Saxon systems and institutions that are doing this. I mean, we have the Bologna process, which explicitly stated that one of its aims was to make European systems of higher education more attractive to international students. So it's explicitly stated in some of their literature. A second driver is the importance of knowledge capital for national competitiveness and economic growth. Now, in a world with these increasingly permeable economic borders, this form of capital, knowledge capital, a type of human capital, if you will, has become a critical component of state policies. And Europe has also been involved in building knowledge capital. We can think of the Horizon 2020 program as geared towards this. And certainly it seems to fund, researchers at the core universities more than peripheral ones. So what this means on a global scale is that academics from the global south are underrepresented in indicators of knowledge capital accumulation. You can think of this in terms of academic publication houses and how they seem to favor elite universities in the Anglosphere rather than academics from the global south. And then the third driver has been these new ideas about governance, and these can quite easily cross borders, quite transnational ideas. So we have these new public management techniques where public universities are being steered and coordinated as if they were market actors. And this is happening everywhere around the world. And the propensity to use these these instruments of governance rather than regulatory tools of government has been a feature of Anglo-Saxon higher education for decades. And it can now be seen at the European level in things like the open method of coordination, which has been used within the Bologna process. Now, many of these governance ideas are international in scope. You can think about benchmarking, global rankings, other forms of quasi-marketization, and new public management techniques. So that's another factor that's really driving this convergence.
Sorry for interrupting. You are already concluding.
Last slide, and I'll hand it back to Kurt to kind of wrap up our presentation here.
Yeah,
all right.
I only need 30 seconds or so. I think that the message was pretty clear in our piece. Let me only address the one element we didn't touch upon at all, and this would be up to further research. the kind of the layering of the global knowledge regime, how we see it, very much driven by this kind of catch up of various universities. But we didn't talk about one particular region where we see, and I'm talking about China in particular, where we see the rise in rankings of Chinese universities, where state action, state policies have become so critical in all kinds of support, financial support, resources, and so on, to help for this kind of catch-up process. But at the same time, those universities also are under kind of strict control, kind of authoritarian state intervention. What all this implies for the future of the global knowledge regime would be up for further research, and maybe we can talk about this also in the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for this provocative, actually, presentation. Even the topic that you raised, but in a different context, is also one of the hot topic in South Africa when it comes to decolonizing Eurocentric knowledge and try to recenter your universities to the local context instead of globalizing. So in that sense, I think this would be a very interesting topic. Thank you for providing context from Europe. The next presentation is by Atmika Shetty and Sushmit Roy. Atmika works as an assistant professor and handling the subject principles of management, banking technology, business analysis for BBA and BCom and international students. Roy is a research scholar at the Manipal Center for European Studies and is pursuing her PhD in the title Shifting Boundaries in Cultural Capital and rethinking the quest for cross-border education among students in and higher education institutions. Her research interest lies in economics and internationalization of higher education, European Union law, and project management. Thank you both. You have 15 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. Our topic here is internationalization of higher education and resource allocation, a cost-benefit perspective for HEIs in India and Europe. Our objective here is to assert the argument that unequal resource distribution plays a vital role in perception and implementation of IHE between the global north and the global south. So how we plan to look at it is from 2 points of view. One is the national and the institutional actors, and to provide a more concise understanding, we look at it from the point of India and Europe. So this is just the contents of what we will be discussing today. Coming to the introduction, I don't think I need to stress more about IHE. Everyone here is very well versed with it. However, I would like to add 2 things. One, of course, what was said in the morning session by our Vice Chancellor about how internationalization amongst IHEs is not just a luxury anymore, it is a necessity. That alone highlights how important internationalization has been towards higher education institutions. Additionally, international organizations have constantly emphasized the importance of IHE at a global level, and even determining that HEIs need to, at a global level, step in and tackle differences between the global north and the global south. Now, IHE is not a static concept; it's constantly its rationale, scope, motivations constantly keep changing. Now, one where we looked at the collaborative model of knowledge capacity and cultural understanding has now taken a subordinate role against the economic rationale. So thus, there are substantial differences in understanding how resources are allocated between the global north and global south, and that is what we're here to talk about. So we quickly run through the rationales of internationalization of higher education. As one of the key facilitators of IHE higher education institutions, we have numerous rationales in pursuing IHE. Of course, there is a strong overlay amongst all of it, and we decided to see it from the point of view of steers through idealism, instrumentalism, and of course, educationalism. Now, just to quickly summarize it, idealism basically focuses on IHE from the point of view that collaborations can bring about a fair and equitable world, whereas instrumentalism provides more emphasis on the economic rationale, saying that IHE is very lucrative in terms of revenue generation. And if you see throughout the slides, you can see the theme of instrumentalism or economic rationale taking precedence over the others. Now, finally, coming to the educationalism point of it, IHE acts as a pathway here towards enlightening academic experiences of staff and students. Now, we see that there is a considerable it's important to understand that there is a considerable overlap between these ideologies, and that these ideologies keep varying based on the internal and external factors of these higher education institutions. So we can't ignore the fact that discrepancies do exist. So now we'd like to look at it from the point of view of the national level, that is highlighting global disparities among global north and global south. So we decided to look at it from the point of view of global rankings and mobility. It is not to say that other parameters don't exist or don't have enough importance. It is just that when we, through our literature review, we saw that these two basically propped up in most of the literature, and we decided to look at these two to provide a more concise understanding. Now, coming to global rankings, we all know that it's a prominent marker of internationalization. There is a constant need to boost university ranking. Now, because of which higher education is seen as a competitive market, and there's a constant culture of improvement amongst institutions. And the focus now has moved from quality to student achievement towards prestige and reputation. Now, just quickly to provide a comparison of India and EU in the global rankings. Now, if you look at the QS World Rankings, top 200 universities in the world, we see that India has only 3, whereas Europe has 88, with Germany, Netherlands, and UK leading the chart. Similarly, if we look at Times Higher Education World Rankings, we have India as 0 and Europe as 90, with Sweden, Germany, and UK taking the lead. And we often notice that even though the importance given for international outlook, be it in ARW, QS, and even THA is minimal, it's seen through the lens of international research, or even inculcating international staff. So we see that internationalization, if not directly, plays a prominent role in other factors of ranking. So despite the fact that India has had considerable investment and considerable development towards incorporating internationalization, we see that India's numbers are still at a low, which is quite perplexing. So two of the aspects that were evident here was, one, low citations in terms of international research and low accumulation of international staff. So when we look at it, this is what we see that is evident. But when we dig deeper, these are some of the aspects we saw, not just from the point of view of India, but also from global north and global south. That there is often a failure to fit in, that higher education institutions that are not quite Anglo-centric and are not part of the world-class club seldom make it to these global rankings. And the second assumption here is that everyone operates with the same amount of knowledge, which is not true. We all know that there is a lack of equity there is between paywall and hidden network. So not everyone operates in the same level of equity. Now, coming third to the creation of global north bias, literature suggests that centers here, centers more than peripheries, that is well-established journals with more emphasis on English language, often tend to lead here in global rankings as opposed to those that aren't. So now coming to the second part of our understanding, which is mobility. We see that the classical divide remains. There is more mobility towards north than south. However, this is not to say that global south has not made strides. Now, global south is becoming a major player, with some countries even being destination rather than just source. However, if we look at it from the resource point of view, the inequalities exist. I will not specify the others because I think the other presenters have made a wonderful job explaining that. So I would like to just talk about the outcomes point of view, wherein your enhancement of degree plays a vital role in how the opportunities are enhanced in the global labor market. So now if we look at the figures here, we see that there has been a considerable change, like I previously mentioned, with China and Japan, two countries in the global south are now being a part, or are not just the source but also the destination. Even if we look at the second figure here, where we talk about top host destinations, in the year 2000 there is only one, there is Japan. However, now we have China and Japan that are host destinations, which is very encouraging. However, if you look at the next slide, while there have been strides, we don't disagree that there haven't been strides, we still see that Global South, even taking India into perspective, more often acts as a source than a destination country. Now, when we look at the countries primarily situated in Global North, we see that most of the countries, most of the students that move towards the Global North countries are from the Global South. So, highlighting that there are disparities that still exist. Now, when we look at it from the India's point of view, of course, we have the advent of NEP 2020, within which India has made considerable investments towards creating an international space and, of course, trying to be Vishwaguru. However, we see that there is a stark difference between the inbound and the outbound mobility. Now, these figures are taken from the UNESCO 2020, and we still see that while the countries of origin primarily are from Southeast Asian countries, destination countries, that outbound students are primarily towards Global North countries, highlighting that there is still a huge amount of discrepancy that needs to be considered. So if we look at it from the point of view of funding also, we see the most common resource disparity, which we can see again coming to India and Europe, is that the budget allocated towards higher education is 4.52 billion euros, which is roughly 3% of our GDP. Whereas in Europe, it is 654 billion euros. However, and also considering the fact that we do have NEP 2020, which provides, which will promise on creating a space towards internationalization, we have Europe with Bologna process, which has already led the way, perhaps having a foot ahead in comparison to India. So now that we've understood the disparities that we see within the national level, we know that these disparities do exist. And despite the imbalance, now we just spoke about funding as being one of the key imbalances. So despite the imbalance in the allocation of the resources, we need to highlight that in case of institutional actors, the costs and the benefits amongst these institutional actors will still remain the same. So this is our key understanding here, is we have decided to look at the costs and benefits. So HEIs around the world here are looking forward to internationalization. It is imperative to understand what are the costs and benefits that are centered around internationalization. So we have looked at costs from the point of view of direct and indirect costs. So now when we say indirect costs, where we basically count it as an externality, as in these costs might be incorporated in the regular spending of the university, whereas direct costs are those that directly affect it. Now, coming to the first point, which is curricular innovation. So when we look at curricular innovation, we need to see that it impacts all of the students of the higher education institution and not just a chosen few. And it needs more than just student experience. So to do this, to incorporate internationalization of curriculum or curricular innovation, we need to understand that we need academic experts and resource experts as well, which requires a considerable amount. Another thing we need to understand here is that we cannot directly cut, copy, paste from the global curriculum. We cannot have a global standard curriculum. Of course, this needs to be tailored to individual perspectives, which is what is required. So we look at resource persons, logistics, and resource person and logistics as direct costs, but it's transport and food and accommodation counted in. Now, coming to the second, which is recruitment of international faculty, which is, of course, a very, very important, not just because it is a marker of rankings, but because it helps in understanding internationalization better. So we have in terms of salaries, accommodation, even legal costs. Same thing with in terms of joint programs. Now, if we are looking at how institutions do look at having joint programs, they need to ensure that adequate infrastructure, expert academic and equipment is necessary. So coming to additional amount of these, we need to understand that there are also international conferences and summer schools which require top residents if you are looking at having an international experience and not just for the sake of it. So therein, of course, we have a lot of direct and indirect costs. Now, coming next to the domestic students' international experiences, here we include only administrative services because this is the lack of a better word. For the lack of better word, fee may be paid or fee may not be paid. Now, if HEI has an agreement with the international university, then in that case, the fee may be split. But sometimes that does not happen, which means either the student takes in the amount that needs to be paid, or the HEI themselves do. Irrespective, they do have to provide administrative services in lieu of visa processing, application processing, and even resources in terms of staff understanding the same and incorporating with the host university. Now, coming next to international learners. So when we look at international learners, we need to know, of course, infrastructure taking the top precedent. Some special academic programs even require an understanding of English language, even providing training in the same, and having equipment that can be used by the students, the incoming students. Now, research with an international dimension. Of course, when we speak of research with an international dimension, it is a very, very important aspect in terms of ranking and has direct costs of infrastructure, human resource, and equipment. Now, the next coming to cultural preparedness. Now, when you talk about internationalization, it would be absolutely incomplete if you don't look at cultural preparedness. Sorry about that. So, if you don't look at cultural preparedness, because it would be unseemly to not prepare the students who are going internationally without a cultural background understanding, or even interacting with students who do come from host universities. So, for which cultural preparedness is very, very important. Additionally, if you are looking at internationalization at home, association clubs play a major role in incorporating the international experience, for which infrastructure and funds are very, very necessary. And finally, we have faculty and staff mobility. Now, staff mobility sometimes is covered by, of course, various grants and funding programs. But if higher education institutions need to provide their staff with international perspective, it is imperative that their staff do have an international intercultural experience, which may not always be covered by these said grants, which means that the institute will have to keep some amount set aside for the same. Now, coming lastly to the institutional services, these are very straightforward. However, aspects like food and accommodation and security may act as externalities, because that is something general which could be incorporated in the day-to-day expenses. Now, next, I would like to talk about organizational costs. Now, speaking of organizational costs, what we have to understand here is academic costs alone do have capacity to surge internationalization. However, it would not be right if we don't talk about organizational costs, because these are very, very important in this. So, speaking of first and foremost, we notice that having an international office is imperative. Because, of course, in India, if you look at it, maintenance of FCRA account is required, which means you need a certain amount of legal process and audit process are involved here. Also, hospitality in terms of entertaining the dignitaries that have come from international spaces, and also utilities and maintenance. To provide the same, you need personnel that do understand the ins and outs of internationalization. So, of course, that would not be only to the top level, but also in terms of international office coordinators, those who provide training workshops. And finally, of course, in order to be truly international, institutions will have to market, which requires adequate knowledge of print and social media. Now, if you look at benefits, however, now I did speak a lot about costs, but if you look at benefits, it just comes in one slide. So here we actually see that while costs can be both short and long term, benefits here are often long term and sometimes even intangible, because the most discernible benefit here is revenue intuition and revenue accommodation, and sometimes even research grants. However, academic benefits and development and ranking don't have a tangible benefit. However, they do help in the overall development or overall understanding of internationalization. So this brings us to our conclusion. Are the costs of IHE more than that of the benefits? And while costs are both short-term and long-term, benefits here are largely long-term and intangible. And disparities here exist both at national and institutional level. So when speaking of IHE, and with so many higher education institutions rushing towards IHE, that does beg the question, are we even ready for it? So, of course, to end with it, there are numerous varying conceptions and rationales of IHE in India and Europe that need to be considered. So, and these are our list of our references. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much for your detailed and insightful presentation. That was very exciting. Now we will go to the last but not the least presentation by Professor Nared. Professor Nared is the founding director of the Center for Innovation and Research in Graduate Education and she's a professor for higher education in leadership in higher education program, College of Education at the University of Washington, Seattle. She has served on many national and international doctoral education reviews, including the German Excellence Initiatives, the US National Research Council, to examine the methodology for the assessment of research doctorate program. Today, she will share with us her thought on the topic, Reimagining Border Crossing in Doctoral Education. Welcome, Professor. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and hello to everyone. And I must say, it could not have been better sequence of this session than it was done, because we heard first a global view, and then by our colleagues not far from Seattle about convergent and converging of higher education and stratification. And actually from what we then we heard from our colleagues from India about cost of international higher education. And what we want to do with my colleague, Dr. Christian Peters from the University of Bremen in Germany, is really to focus on structures. How can we structure workshop and conference so we really integrative, and so we do something very different, but our content of the conference and the model we will present actually is very much what our colleagues from the University of British Columbia, Kurt Hübner and Conrad King was presenting. So what we would like here is to encourage the audience to experiment with a workshop and a conference model, an example that seemed to have succeeded in reimagining multiple border crossing in doctoral education. And that is the crossing between generations, that means the senior people and doctoral candidates, students, PhDs, so on, and early career researchers, border crossing between disciplines, between countries, and crossing towards a future of doctoral education, focusing on societal needs and focusing on social justice. So as you may know, and as we heard also today generally for higher education, but this is as much for doctoral education as well, it has become a key element in higher education landscape everywhere. There have been significant changes in doctoral education worldwide, specifically in the last 20 years. In many countries, such as in India and in South Africa and many African countries everywhere, but also somewhat in Europe, the numbers of doctoral candidates and of doctoral granting institution has increased in the hope to drive both national innovations and research performance of individual institutions. At the same time, the world is changing faster than ever, especially since the wake of the COVID pandemic. So training doctoral candidates to become the next generation, and here I quote what the League of European University once termed so nicely, becoming the next generation of creative, critical, autonomous, and responsible intellectual risk takers is more essential than ever in these times of epochal and unsettling changes. So in this context, before the pandemic in 2018, we gathered colleagues who are experts in doctoral education and who are actively engaged with a passionate commitment to preparing the next generation of doctoral graduates. So we applied to the Volkswagen Foundation, a private German foundation, which has allocated substantial resources to doctoral education since the end of the 20th century. We applied to them for a grant for a 3-day international workshop and a 1.5-day conference on doctoral education, which was then held in September 2019. So the goal of the workshop, so I presented, and the goal of the workshop was to have, was 41 selected people. And then we had 180 people in the conference, and it was to review the changes in doctoral education around the world, its successes and failure, which was happened through the many reforms occurring everywhere, and to explore the way forward in training the next generation, our future leaders. And the tangible goal was to come up at the end of the international conference with policy recommendations. So we were absolutely sure and committed that such an event or events too, the workshop and the conference, must involve advanced doctoral students and those who just completed their degree. In European Union terminology, they are called the early career researchers, or I will call them now ECR. So let me talk then in more detail about the workshop and the conference. The workshop followed the format of an international workshop series that we developed here at the Center for Innovation and Research in Graduate Education. And we did 5 such workshops between 2005 and 2011. They were all internet. These workshops always included experts from all 6 continents, graduate deans, funders of doctoral education, top university administration, and most importantly, doctoral candidates. These meetings then were vehicles for stimulating cross-national research and for establishing international networks for information exchange and collaboration. So we were very happy to, okay, I can't see myself, but that's fine. We were very happy to have received travel and workshop fellowships for 16 ECRs. Without these kind of support, many of them would have not been able to participate. So what we did then, we sent out an announcement of that fellowship, which would pay for flight regardless of the world where the ECR was, and for the whole week accommodations and everything. We just heard about the costs, how much international higher education is coming up to. So we got these fellowships and we asked them in their application to send us a 3-minute video in which the ECRs had to explain why they should be selected and what they could contribute to the workshop and the conference. We received about 50 applicants, which we then evaluated and ranked by us organizers, keeping in mind our goal of diversity, that means race, gender, ethnicity, as well of all 6 continents. So we had, of course, someone from India. In addition, just as in the senior workshop, for the senior workshop members, the ECR could also select from one of the 5 topics of that conference and then join the subsequent working group. And in the past slide, actually, here are the 5 topics briefly. An overview about forces and forms and structure, at quality assurance in doctoral education since this century, supervision and funding from an institutional viewpoint, capacity building in the area of globalization, the global labor market, and so on, and ethic and political role of researcher, particularly for doctoral students. So during the bi-monthly video meetings, and this was well before COVID, we used this, the teams came together to really think about their topic and then and their analysis, and then prepared a draft paper. And those working of the 5 groups were about, I said, senior people, experts, and in each group 2 to 4 ECRs. And then the resulting workshop paper were distributed before the event, before everybody came together. Then during the workshop, the groups presented to the 3-day workshops. The working groups presented their paper, but it was really stimulated by always having an expert commentator for each topic. So we had, being in Germany, a director of a Max Planck Institute in molecular biology. Then we had a vice chancellor for research from Malaysia, a senior professor and advisor to this Japanese Research Council, and a dean from New Zealand, a graduate dean, and the president of the US Council of Graduate Schools. So these papers were presented and then further developed during these during the workshop, and then presented at the subsequent conference. Being funded by the Volkswagen Foundation, which we can only recommend, they have this wonderful conference center, the Herrenhaus, which is a renovated palace in Hanover, Germany, and it provided the most conducive, congenial working environment. So what is important and what we want to emphasize here in international collaboration and international higher education, that is the role of the ECRs. So from the very beginning of the 3-day workshops, the 11 ECRs were asked to prepare for each workshop day their views, comments, and concerns relating to what they have heard and experienced the previous days. And they were encouraged to do this creatively, as they always were the first event of the workshop day. And I can tell you, they really did come up with wonderful creative role plays, and you can ask me later what, for example, they did. So this special role and space for daily feedback by the ECR not only enliven the conference, so it's not the usual routine and so on, but we start out laughing the day, and we made sure that their voices were heard. This provided also confidence and camaraderie among the ECR during the 3 days, which then carried over into the open public conference following the workshop. To give you an idea about the multiple border crossing beyond the very purposefully generational crossing, the ECRs came from all kinds of countries, and I name them here by alphabet, from Australia, Canada, Chile, China, Finland, Germany, India, Japan, Kazakhstan, Romania, South Africa, UK, the US, and Zambia. And they were diverse in culture, racial, ethnic, professional, and educational background. The diversity was also reflected in a diversity across their initial starting points, their assumptions, and experience in doctoral education. Some were based in their home countries, while others were far away from home in both established and emerging higher education systems. The majority of the group were not native speakers of English and thus had to navigate international academic discourse in a language other than in their mother tongues, which is so often the case. For some, their field of inquiry was focused directly on higher education and doctoral education, but for a good number of others had an interest in various disciplines, but were equally invested in the state of doctoral education and in the success of future doctoral researchers. The diversity of the group, as they wrote in the chapter, which we asked them to reflect after the conference, wrote, the diversity of the group allowed the boundaries of discussion to be expanded and allowed an open dialogue about doctoral education in the varied international context. Because what we did after the conference, we asked the ECRs to present their collective reflection in a book chapter, consider also the future of doctoral education while reflecting on their past experiences and lessons learned from immersion into doctoral education issues, and to explore the core values which we came out of doctoral education as a result of our final conference policy recommendation. And now we want to hear from our colleague, Christian, about the conference itself and how creatively he came up to use technology to arrive at a set of 7 recommendations and to arrive collectively there. Christian?
Yes, hello, Marisi. Hello, all together. Emnet, I see you sweating because I think we're just using our time up, but I try to be very, very quick on that because it's been quite an interesting process, and I think that as Marisi just said, I think that there is a contingent order that happened here in this section. Where we can now talk about how the real practice of these, counterbalances of inequality structures that we have identified in the global knowledge system, how they may manifest. And I really think that both the conference and the workshop and the results that are going to be published in the book, which I proudly may announce in the next months, that resulted from that conference on global doctoral education, how they came together. And what Marisi just said is that really this conference has been remarkable because many of the things that we know by now, how digital media may help, not necessarily, but may help to circumvent certain language regimes that are asymmetric in power, because people can, they can talk and we are rather equal without all the, the symbolisms that are happening in space and in the present moment. So digitalization helped to that. But we did that before COVID was, and we not only had a long structured global process of gathering information in advance to have a maximum of represented diversity, not only with, with reference to the people that we invited, but also with reference to what was being said. But we then went one step further at the conference. We realized, okay, there is another layer of inequality that happens in the realm of academia, and that has very much to do with the position, with the career position that people are in when they are in such conferences. And I've been in many conferences, and I've been very fed up quite early from being a student on with the fact that usually in conferences the discussion is dominated by what would I call the silverbacks. That means it's typically the very experienced researchers and scholars that have a reputation, that are invited, that are pampered in the environment of such an event, and you know, have monologues, long monologues, and the knowledge that would be around in a conference environment will not manifest in the way it could. And that's how we circumvented that mechanism, that social mechanism that most probably everybody of us knows, of the symbolic capital in academia, by using a tool which is called Slido. So we could, while the conference was running, we could equally ask everybody to bring on questions, and people could, at the same time that people were discussing about the topics, they could vote the topics. So it was a democratic process. So everybody had the right to enter questions. Imagine that we would have that right now. All 60, 70 people that are in this virtual room right now could enter questions, and then the audience would vote them up or vote them down, whether they're interesting or not. So that went exquisitely. And secondly, we also had a major participation by the audience by just asking them to give input to the topics that were being discussed in that, you know, multi-layered process that Maresi has been describing right now. I would probably, Emnet, you have to give me a sign whether we're at the very end of it, because if we are, then I would, 2 minutes, 2 or 3 more minutes, yeah. I would probably skip the recommendations themselves. I think they are important. I think they are very much incorporating a lot of that, what is being discussed at this meeting here. And I can, in a second, I will show you a link where you can find that online, because we have resources. You don't have to wait for the book if you want to get closer into that. But something that I would love to quickly say, and maybe we can cover that in the discussion later, is that, as Maresi already said, that the colleagues from British Columbia were covering the question of, or the obviously paradox of a simultaneous homogenization and differentiation in higher education when it becomes global. I think that, you know, the inherent contradiction that happens here. So everybody has to speak obviously a global language, and that even extends to the question of what language is used, English, as is here right now, which makes simultaneously disappear a lot of other languages. So there is the homogenization, but at the same time, there is always a call for being very well aware of what is being put to the periphery. And to make that speak. And this balance, finding this balance really has been the ultimate driver and the intellectual driver of our conversation. So we were talking about, you know, homogenization processes and a global normative approach, which is, you know, that's quite a task, while at the same time preserving a maximum of diversity, both with respect to the knowledge types, but also to the different administration that doctoral education runs through. It's a huge topic. I sent the link around. You can dive yourself into it. And Maresi, you will have the honor of the last words. And thanks a lot for inviting me.
And indeed, the last words. So I want to give you 3 big takeaways, lessons learned from these ECRs, and why we think that model, how we're doing, was quite useful. And that is, they came away and said they really understood about, and were surprised about the sheer depths and diversities of practices, norms, policies, and debates around doctoral education. They had no idea of, just taking the example, some people talk about doctoral students, PhD students, graduate students, doctoral researcher, doctoral scholars, junior researcher, early career research, just like that. But also they came away realizing that some of the challenges faced in doctoral education are the same everywhere. Third, they really understood that it's actually worthwhile, the art of learning, to provide guiding principles, even when they're general, that can be applied to various contexts. And they really thought about how that space and the voice they were given through this entire week really made them engage in the doctoral community and not just with. So they really felt that they were into the community, part of the community, and not as so often at academic conferences, just a could talk with. And they really understood in the future, it's their responsibility to really come up and consider what's the role in coming up and serving societal needs with the privilege they're having of having a doctorate.
Prof, I have to stop you now.
Right. And I said, my last thing is that they realized we are not alone. They realized even without blowing our budgets, we can still communicate. And they said we learned that not only the way we practice doctoral education is context-based and historical, but we need to cross borders and do so also in understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Nared and Christian. I was about to stop you at some point, but it's very interesting. So I just let it go. Thank you, colleagues. And I would like to say thank you all presenters for interesting, provocative presentations. I would like to open the floor for questions. You just raise your hand, I guess, on the system, or drop your question on the Q&A section. Any questions? Okay, I will start my question. I think my question first goes to Kennedy. I was struck by the fact that most Indian students actually travel to Germany, France, and UK. I understand the connection with UK. But like most universities, especially in France, and also to some extent in Germany, are still maintaining their language. I mean, there are few universities that actually give training in English, especially at the master's and undergraduate level. So apart from scholarship opportunities through probably Erasmus Mundus and other university-related fundings, do you see any reason why Indian students prefer to travel to Germany and France? I ask this question because I was also trained in Germany, and I know my reason why I was there. And then it is not easy also for graduates to penetrate the labor market in Europe, even if you are graduated there, for a number of reasons. So do you find any other variables for German students to travel to these two countries in particular, Germany and France? Kennedy, are you there?
Okay, yes, I'm there. Thank you for the question. I think when we examine the recent student and academic flow, so we observe that students are moving, as I mentioned, that they are moving to a country that has a well technological frontier, because we're saying that knowledge flows from where? From a technological frontiers to downward. So my thinking is the reason as why maybe Indian students are flowing to Germany is because of reputation in research, and also courses that are maybe are not available in India and they're available in German. So I think that maybe might be the reason as to why there's a flow of Indian students to German. I hope I've answered. Yeah.
Well, if you really look into the ranking of those universities that receive a lot of students from India or also from other countries, including African countries, they are not really top in the ranking. Probably, Prof. Nared, do you have something to add on that? Yeah, Prof.
Yes, you have to also consider very practical, down-to-earth issue, which actually our colleagues, Anamika and so on, pointed out. Germany does not have fees, unlike the UK or something, and France also. In Germany, any students, regardless where they're from, pay only the health insurance. So that's also a big issue, and not just the ranking, the cost.
Christian?
I have a question, but I'm not sure if I'm in a row, and maybe we are suppressing, the audience questions, which I would rather hear than just the panel talk to itself. But if there are none, I would love to ask it. So, Emnet, do you?
You can keep the question. Let's reflect on this one, and then we can come back to your question.
Okay.
Kurt, please.
Yeah, coming back to your question, why Germany, the missing fees are an element, but I think so, and this comes back to our topic, Conrad and mine. There is the German Academic Exchange Service, so that's the most prominent, the largest state-run agency, financially state-run in terms of content independent, that brings in foreign students. So there are actors who are really for a long time engaged in student mobility, and not only sending German students abroad, but also in particular attracting students from abroad to German universities. And India is one location, China, a lot of countries outside the European Union. And I think so we have to take this into consideration, that there are state policies, state strategies that really push this kind of internationalization and make and advertises German universities across the world.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay. Atmika?
Yes, I would like to add to the point that also why Indian students come to Germany. One is the language of teaching course. If you notice that those are mostly English-speaking courses which is offered. Also coming down to people move towards science. They have a lot of engineering students back in Germany. And last but not the least, also if a student has at least an A1 level of German language learned, he or she gets a monthly scholarship of 500 euros. So I think that's a very important aspect, incentives for Indian students to go, provided going to other destinations in Europe. So yeah.
Christian?
So my question now. I'd love to bring something together, which I found very interesting. I must admit, I'm a political scientist myself, and I've been always sort of envious of the political economists, because they're creating an enormous rational explanation for a lot of stuff that happens when telling somebody who's talking about norms and ideas that at the very end it's the market, stupid. And so what I've seen in your presentation, Conrad and Kurt, and I found that very convincing, is that the convergence that you were describing was basically following, the neoliberal globalization argument to some extent, by showing how a lot of the processes of accumulation of symbolic and knowledge capital are following a market routine. And at the same time, I've seen the colleagues from Manipal bringing into the, looking at how unequally the the flows are running and how the attractors and the attracted are not equally distributed, and bringing in the ideas of relating that to the costs and benefits. So you could say that a very strong concentration of the idea of costs and benefits is already part of the problem, because that's an evaluation of what education could be worth within a marketed environment. So this is the footnote I would like to make, and I would like to also again quote you were saying at the very end, that you've been looking at the OECD and maybe invisibly at the relationship between the global north and the global south, as defined through a socio-economic distribution pattern. But then there is the emergence of another type of higher education or of global education that is run by actors that are not following the market routines, but that are working along, maybe some sort of a new colonialism, whereas I would say that academia has been always a very colonial system and still tends to be, but there is a new colonial system that follows, a different sort of empire, and that would be, again, the reemergence of authoritarian regimes and decisions made by leaders and by parties about, how the way that the global system should interact. Maybe you can say a little about that. So it was a footnote on the relationship between the two presentations, and maybe if you or Conrad would let us know a little about your ideas.
Thank you, Christian. Maybe I will add two more questions on those on the convergence. You use homogenization and convergence as a concept when you discuss the process, which is in most cases not very much welcome in the policy discourse, because they prefer to use harmonization and standardization most probably than homogenization. And I would like you to reflect on those concepts. And the other one is when you discuss the drivers of convergence, or you emphasize on the external factors including the neoliberal processes and the Bologna processes as a factor for impacting convergence processes at national level. Are there any also national processes that add to except the one that you mentioned, these centers of excellence in Germany? Apart from those, are there any national processes that also contribute to this trend of convergence? Kurt?
Yeah, maybe I can. We have to be now very short. It would be very exciting to continue, because you all pose very interesting questions. Starting with Christian, from my perspective, indeed, that's an open gap. It's interesting to see China was actually a kind of net ascending country. Most of those students, not all of them, but went to the US, particularly in the sciences. And there was a lot of training effect. It scaled back a bit to China, but I think so. We have to see China is overall undergoing huge transformations, and rather than sending students to all those kind of other places, whether it's in Europe or in China, in the US or in the UK or so, they now try to bring them back as soon as possible and to upgrade their own institutions. That's no longer necessary to train those people. So in this regard, when it comes to the kind of the content of education, particularly postgraduate education, I think that they try to be more independent, but at the same time, we see a very strong state intervention when it comes to defining the kind of the borders of education, what is being allowed, particularly in the social sciences, to be researched, to be said, and all those kind of things. So it's a totally different model. It's interesting to see that indeed we will see a kind of fourth model, the three we differentiated. There's a fourth one emerging, and this may be becoming very powerful, not so much that it would change the trades, the regimes outside China, but China will become its own kind of a strong location, maybe not so much attracting students, but really a kind of independent, autonomous machinery in itself. And this is very much to do with the kind of the policies on the side of the government, of the state. So that's the China part. When it comes to the drivers of this homogenization and at the same time differentiation processes, and again, I mean, I think so. We have to be aware that not only today but for the future, skills training will be very, very critical for international competitiveness. It's already the case, but more and more. So we will see, and in some universities we can already observe this. There's kind of the emphasis on social sciences is decreasing, the emphasis on sciences is increasing. So we see those kind of changes happening. This is the same in Germany. If you look at the excellent initiatives and so on, it's really focusing resources on a very few universities, and that's it. Okay, we have
just probably to just drop one question for Prof. Nerid and Christian on the doctoral training. There is now this huge trend in some African countries and probably also in other developing countries, graduate unemployment, high rate of PhD graduate unemployment. Last week, there was a news from Algeria, 22,000 PhD unemployments recorded this year, which is huge. So there is a huge discussion on our PhD programs and their relevance for our society in general. Do you reflect? I mean, you have been working on this issue for a long time. Do you have something to say? Just 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, I start. Yes, it's very uneven, the unemployment. There are countries like South Africa and India and Chile and Brazil. They need professors in the academic sectors, and they don't have enough, specifically India. And others, as you mentioned, Nigeria, Europe, US, have a lot because everybody increased. What is happening is a very strong to make the doctoral students aware that there's a job market outside academia. And actually the unemployment rate of PhDs who are not in academia and outside is very, very low. So it's really, that's why many countries have in doctoral education what we call a lot of professional skills development, making doctoral students while they're in study aware of all the skills they have and working with employers to really also accept people with a PhD. For example, in Japan, they had also the trouble that traditionally Japanese companies hires after the bachelor, but this is something where also university, national governments need to work together and not just create what Europe did, what I call a postdoc mountain, just put the problem one step further and not deal with it, but really deal with that there's employment in various sectors.
Thank you, Prof. Christian, do you have last word?
Last word is that what you were describing, I think, must not necessarily be seen from the dynamics of the education system, but by the flexibility of the labor markets. That means this potential mound of unemployed PhD absolvents, if they were looking just for an academic career, as Marisi said, they might not, because that depends on the educational system, but there are many placements that are possible for PhDs. Not saying that this is a good way, but it's an option.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And King, Prof. King, maybe I have to give you 1 minute just to reflect if you have anything to say.
Yeah, I actually have to teach in 5 minutes. I have an online class. I think Kurt quickly addressed the national convergence processes question by talking about the German, what's been happening in Germany as a national reflection of global pressures. So there are national convergence processes in places like Germany and France and other countries as well as a response to globalization and neoliberal globalization. Now, very quick on harmonization versus homogenization. It's a facile answer, but I think homogenization speaks to what Christian is talking about, what political scientists like myself are interested in, ideas and norms. It homogenizes a kind of a culture, whereas harmonization might be a kind of rational response to other coordinating policies with other countries. And even the terminology of harmonization is itself quite controversial. If I was speaking in Europe to a Bologna process crowd, they'd be quick to catch me out and say, it's not harmonization, it's mutual recognition. And there's a distinct difference between the two. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, there's a lot of harmonization happening. So there's a quick response to a couple of your questions there. And thank you all. I very much appreciated the time, but I must now go teach a class. So.
All right. Thank you all the panels and the participants for this interesting discussion. Hopefully you will continue the conference tomorrow. I can't join you, have something else, but it was really a pleasure to see you all and hearing the contributions and the debates. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Emnet, and thank you all the presenters for such a wonderful discussion. We come to an end to day 1 of this conference. We meet tomorrow, India time, 1 p.m. and I hope you all will be there. Yeah, thank you so much.